for someone, perhaps a young student in Europe, say, that did not watch all of these events for 5 to 6 hours per day on television, clearly explained by political experts and the protagonists themselves, this detailed introductory explanation is vital for any significant or even partial understanding of this art and Trump situation. Therefore, this long introduction is intended to explain the history, background, mostly liberal criticisms, and some of the satire employed here in the art opposing Trump and his lack of effective 2020 actions to control the COVID pandemic. My explanations should make this art more intelligible to non-political scholars, students, and anyone that did not watch the 2020 USA presidential election news for many hours per day. This introduction also introduces, identifies, and partially explains some of the famous medieval art used here as the primary background and transmitting media for these 2020 election and concurrent pandemic events. I've also added some minor contemporary historical perspectives and explanations for anyone studying this 100 years from now, say, who might be trying to understand the relationship between 2020 politics and about 75 or more of the 500-year-old famous paintings of plague and religious persecution issues, including many small portions of some famous ancient artwork inserted into the basic backgrounds in collage form. I used those 75 or more medieval paintings and photographs of painted images and mosaics of hell and purgatory, etc., from church walls, primarily as backgrounds, to which I added about 50 to 95% of my own content to each of this group of 19 vignettes, plus the side frames. Those medieval images, plus my edits and substantial contemporary message additions to them, now clearly and accurately portray this very severe 2020, totally out of control worldwide coronavirus pandemic. My art and this explanatory introduction now attempt to explain the pandemic's present direct threat to American democracy in combination with the numerous different additional existential threats to the stability of all U.S. governments at all levels, now very realistically posed overall by Donald Trump trying to win this presidential election again only 10 days from now. For several months now, as Trump's prospects of retaining power legitimately have diminished, he has and is personally desperately attempting to hold on to power with numerous unlawful criminal schemes, especially focused on seriously thwarting the immutable U.S. mail system. Many of those illicit Trump plots to improperly retain power involve corrupt, unlawful obstruction of the U.S. ballot mailing system and include, without limitation, removing automated equipment at very key city locations where Democrats are mostly dominant. Those machines sort, process, and expedite the U.S. mail in order to prevent Democratic mail-in ballots from reaching their destination by the strict statutory deadlines. Also intentionally creating unconscionably long lines at vote-in-person locations to interfere with primarily, again, Democrats' in-person voting location convenience, procedures, and security. He is grossly restricting the location and number of drop boxes for secure, expeditious voting by mail, preventing or obstructing mail-in voting or any form of voting in the numerous purely known almost 100% Democratic areas. He is generally obstructing all mail-in votes on the theory that twice as many Democrats vote by mail, from reaching their destination by the statutory time limits. He has raised objections to all signature and ballot envelopes and identification, verification, and all ballot counting procedures, etc., all in order to promote lawsuits which will contest the results of the election in crucial battleground states indefinitely, etc. Trump's basic theory now is that he's president, and if no votes are cast or counted going forward, then he will remain as president as long as he can confuse the basic issues in the courts and in public opinion. He still does not understand that the Constitution has other provisions for most of these unusual and unprecedented contingencies, discussed later. Retaining the presidency by every possible desperate illicit means conceivable is now a serious and ongoing plot by Trump and his immoral confederates, and whether those documented, ongoing, and anticipated Trump obstructions will prevent or significantly restrict Trump's opposition vote in important swing states like Texas, Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Iowa, and others remains to be seen. None of those intentional, overt, corrupt felony obstructions have ever before been attempted in this country at the presidential level, but never before have we had a U.S. presidency run by what appear to be quasi-mafia corrupt interests, very desperately and resourcefully fighting by any illicit means conceivable to remain in power. All of the above schemes have been well publicized and documented by various investigations, intelligent TV commentators, and whistleblowers, and evidence of their details go well beyond the scope of this simple artwork. Simply put, Trump desperately wants and absolutely and unscrupulously intends to stay in power no matter what desperate criminal acts it requires. He has made it clear that he does not think that he should have to go through an election or have people vote for him. That is because he is now a dictator, and he intends to remain one no matter what, without any election or voting interfering with his control and power. He has basically promised to remain in power and to become an autocratic dictatorship, largely because he clearly fears going to prison if he loses the election, and that fear is quite likely justified. In a close election, perhaps he could get away with it almost, but in a negative landslide or obvious Biden electoral victory, his supporters will abandon him and he'll have to leave voluntarily or with a military escort if necessary. It's obvious to me that Trump and his family inferentially profit greatly from the presidency, with hundreds of millions of dollars of illicit profits. If and when those are lost, if he's forced to leave office, those illicit hotel and bribery profit streams will dry up and will likely lead to the calling in of his $500 million of loans, which have been well publicized lately, and then the rapid financial disintegration, total collapse and ruin of his family's mafia-like business empire will likely follow, in my opinion. Therefore, Trump's financial empire, grossly exaggerated in scope as it always was, appears destined for financial ruin in the short term, no matter what the outcome of this election. The golden Trump name on the side of a building was once a desirable, profitable, highly sought-after status symbol when it often provided a business benefit during the days of The Apprentice, but today it is detrimental and a sign to many to stay away, unlike even 4 years ago. Therefore, Trump is now desperate, fighting to save his family and their lives, and committing mail and voting fraud schemes are second nature, and easy to do when his own and family survival is involved. Whether Trump can obstruct the mail seriously enough to prevent Democrats from getting their mail-in votes actually counted for offices at all levels, branches, and types of the U.S. government, or whether Trump can successfully execute his plan to legally and semi-legitimately tie up the results of enough elections to allow him to remain on as president, no matter what the preliminary vote counts are, is or are legitimately and anxiously still in doubt today. The election now depends on legitimately counting the votes from certain important swing states discussed next. Swing states are now crucial. The definition of a swing state means basically that they do not automatically vote the same way in each election cycle, and hence tend to determine the results of each election and who gets more or less than the 270 electoral votes needed to secure the presidency. In other words, some states vote the same way each year, and there's only 5 to 10 states which don't, and therefore determine the balance of the election usually. This year and for the last several years, those swing states include Florida, Ohio, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Texas, Arizona, and Michigan. And as usual, they are the master keys here. Most other states vote reliably and consistently, either Democrat or Republican in most years, and are expected to continue to do so reliably. And they do not change or swing. Who wins by what margin and when on election night or beyond in about 6 or 7 of those swing states will absolutely be critical this year and could decide the election early without months of protracted litigation, i.e. if anti-Trump forces can get enough ballots cast and actually lawfully counted in just 3 to 4 of those states to defeat Trump, then he mathematically cannot get to the retired 270 electoral votes, and therefore the rest of his illicit plot to try to steal the election, actually on election night itself, will almost certainly fail as soon as election night. For example, he has to have Florida to win and to get to 270 electoral votes, and if for some reason Florida is turned against him even on election night, that will favor Biden in all the other races, and it will certainly mitigate against having electoral challenges in 15 or 20 states if he has already lost Florida, which he has to win. He has to have won in order to get to the presidency. Alternatively, if one of the two candidates fails to get to 270, the other automatically has at least 1 to 2 more votes than that, since there are exactly 538 total electoral votes, but they're mostly in large blocks. A 269 to 269 tie is mathematically possible. It did happen once, but it's extremely unlikely in the present situation and electoral posture reflected in the polls, which now shows Trump losing pretty big. Contested, legally obstructed election. As discussed, if neither Trump nor Biden clearly, and obviously gets 270 electoral votes on election night or in the next 1 to 2 days thereafter when they're counted, then Trump and his Republican Confederates' illicit fallback strategy could take effect, which is to file numerous lawsuits in numerous jurisdictions contesting individual ballots, procedures, signatures, or claiming any number of other types of fraud. Republicans will try to have one or more of these cases reach the U.S. Supreme Court, and there declare Trump the winner in enough contested elections to make him president again. This scenario is unlikely but cannot be ruled out yet, with conservative Republicans now holding a 6-3 majority, with the new justice just brought onto the bench, the ninth, to just yesterday, and now justice and fairness may not prevail in a proper case. The mechanics and details of all this could be very complicated, very unsatisfactory to most citizens or outside observers, and litigating specific vote counts could take many weeks or months to resolve. If that happens, there's a very realistic danger that circumstances in this close, controversial election will not have sufficient real provable irregularities of a sufficient magnitude and number to actually change the electoral result in even one state, let alone the final totals. And that will be unsatisfactory to all voters and hopefully can be avoided from a democratic fairness perspective. That's why if this is all settled on election night, that will certainly be helpful. Otherwise, the uncertainties and irregularities are bound to increase. On the other hand, Trump and his Republican accomplices have been scamming and planning for this realistic eventuality of a close, contested, and possibly fraudulently determined election for about 2 months now, and their scheme could be operational within a week if the election is too close and provably evidentiarily controversial. Wherever the closest margins are in the most important swing states, we can expect legal challenges from the Trump side, which hopefully will not be significant or successful. New Trump, relatively judicially inexperienced sycophant Justice Barrett, has now just yesterday been confirmed and placed on the highest USA court, the Supreme Court, and should be ready for any contested election results next week. Unfortunately, we should all hope there are none, because any that reach the Supreme Court are very likely to go Trump's way with this biased court. But of course, we don't know that. Hopefully, we will not have to find out through an unfair, contested, disputed ruling. Trump's several thousand election lawyers plan and hope to and could tie this 2020 election up indefinitely, giving him a possibly legally valid excuse to stay on, to manage the country while the election results are being contested, briefed, inflamed with irrelevant passion, and eventually decided, but probably not resolved. If the court cases stay open and the problems are never resolved, then Trump would have an argument for remaining president indefinitely. However, that would violate the Constitution, which happily does provide for others taking over in such an eventuality, such as the Speaker of the House in one prominent scenario. Anyway, political theory aside, please take a careful and detailed look on your own electronic device, with the bigger the screen the better, at the huge still image, at the long Google Direct Drive link provided directly below the screen discussed previously. I will be summarizing that huge digital art image here in this video in different ways in a bit, including in words in this narrative and with a short video scrolling back and forth with my full-frame Canon 5D camera with the image at quite high magnification. That may work satisfactorily, but I don't know yet, and if you can look at it on your own device or computer, that would be better. I will also be blowing up the detailed prints all 21, counting the side frames of them in Mac QuickTime, and then putting them together in iMovie to hopefully put this all together smoothly, coherently, professionally, and without unnecessary visual distractions. This artwork described here is very unusual, probably unprecedented. I've certainly never seen anything like it. It is unique, large election, public service, serious political image in association with brilliant, world-famous medieval art, as contrasted with my normal work, which is colorful redwood and other California decorative landscaping and fine art images. My original objective here when making this consolidated framed art image was to get onto MSNBC or CNN on their liberal blue state message shows, and then get the message out to red state Trump voters and Fox News commentators, pundits, and viewers primarily. That was the intention, which is not coming through now. I totally was not just trying to reach liberal Democratic sycophants that obviously agree with all of this initially, and long ago had already decided to vote against Trump and all down ballot Republicans in any and every way possible, plus contribute some money to the cause. But I'm not a financial, political contributor to any side, nor do I have any financial stake or anticipated benefit from a Biden victory. However, any Trump victory by honest vote or blatant stealing of this election in the middle of this COVID pandemonium would be catastrophic to me and to the country, in my opinion. In other words, I had hoped to inject some controversy into the election and get people talking, thinking, and trending on Twitter in order to change some pro-Trump votes. That plan has now failed in the short term, as for different reasons, including the fact that this work was banned on Twitter because it's political and controversial. My goals are not now being met for a variety of reasons, including without limitation, due to the extreme complexities in the free media industries, its difficulties, plus my own inexperience therewith. 2, my lack of time now before November 3rd, as the work itself took about a month longer than expected, plus having to deal with social media, Twitter as explained, YouTube, when the TV and newspapers fell through. 3, my lack of youthful energy to energetically represent and expedite this work the way I would have recently when I had the energy and mental acuity of being 25 to 75, etc., would have also helped. It's now going to be hard to get these messages out to anyone before the election, let alone to any potential Trump voters. However, I'm still trying full time. This image was never really specifically designed, intended, or oriented towards any of those anti-Trump people, as I just said, except for liberal newspapers or television hosts to hopefully present it, which did almost happen, and it still could happen, but hasn't yet. Anyway, my initial goals and objectives have now changed due to, without limitation, the vicissitudes of life above the Democratic and Republican media biases against anything new, unknown, controversial, or that might impact advertising sales and profits, the concurrent related necessity to retain TV, magazine, and newspaper commercial sponsors to pay their staff and shareholders. My goals have also changed due to the numerous other important competing daily vote-counting political, pandemic, anti-Trump, severe, isolated White House pandemic epidemics. In other words, the daily news has been extreme, especially involving the pandemic. Another factor, the numerous repeated whistleblower stories that have been out lately has made this tougher. The desire and necessity to avoid controversial, perhaps sponsor upsetting material such as this mitigates against network TV picking this up. Will initially now probably result in sending this work towards only like-minded blue state people before the election. That was not what I wanted, expected, hoped for, or intended. However, that's the way it goes. This material has so far proven to be a bit too controversial for the mainstream media such as CBS, NBC, radio, or even national magazines, and so far has also been unwelcome to Fox News or newspapers, although I've offered it to all of those. I thought this image would be picked up by Rachel Maddow and Nicole Wallace, and the day I sent it to her, she did comment on TV in a manner which gave me some hope. She discussed how people were trying to make a difference and how they had to decide each day which things were worthy of getting on TV, and I had to think that this was considered, but so far has not been accepted. And it may or may not be. The issues are still timely, but perhaps they are just too divisive, unpleasant, and antagonistic, especially with Biden's message being one of unification and not divisiveness and fighting with Fox News hosts such as this art does. They have a pretty obsequious and benign message, which maybe is what the country needs, but it's not exactly what this art provides. Anyway, the big networks have not shown any interest in the art so far, and the Biden-Harris campaign in particular have barraged me with daily solicitation requests about sending them $20 to $50, which I haven't done. MSNBC has too many crucial competing political stories, whistleblowers, disgruntled White House employees, and Trump relatives to seriously cover my art or to take time on something controversial, negative, and arguably antagonistic like this, which could inflame the disagreeing right. That's true, and potentially unsettle the country even worse, which is also true. Also, the Trump right, if angered, could hurt network advertising and perhaps go to war with me or whoever promotes this, which probably has become an intangible and unplanned for by me problem to getting this out to the public, but I'm working on it. Eventually, when it's finished and developed, I'll put it out suitably at my own expense as required, which is what this is. And but unfortunately, in the near term, this art will not be fully publicized timely as planned. Probably the Trump lovers, apologists, blind followers, and asymptomatic COVID carriers will eventually find this work and commentary anyway and succeed in ostracizing, pillaring, and punishing me in some manner, even years after it makes any difference. In any case, as to the basic message and timing, my best hope now is that the American people are smarter and angrier on their own now than I had expected, and will therefore vote Trump out of their own volition from their present information and not based on any artwork from me. I was trying to make a difference, but hopefully that difference will not be required this time. Maybe next time as my art continues full time. And this art does change and develop somewhat over time. If Trump is voted out resoundingly enough, he will have to leave without starting an armed insurrection from one side or the other, which is possible. The armed insurrection is possible, but not as likely anymore in a Biden semi-landslide. Perhaps this art will not win over any red state voters to Biden and will do more harm than good to bring harmony to this country in a Biden victory. Probably born-again Trump apologists are not worried much about going to hell or purgatory, as I had initially naively hoped, and therefore this art will not cause any fear in the former, but only be popular with or of intellectual interest to hardcore, strongly anti-Trump zealots. As I said, that was not my original intention, but intentions can change. Art is a form of entertainment, and the original objectives of this art have disappointingly not been met. But hopefully the overall objective will happen on its own. Probably some form of entertainment will still eventually, even if not as planned. I cannot emphasize the importance of getting rid of Trump enough to any serious political scholar. Happily, thanks to anti-Trump fate, or perhaps the gods somewhere or whatever, COVID has increased so exponentially lately, particularly in red states, and also conveniently for this art project. Trump's response has been so obviously, publicly, morally, and absurdly wrong, dead wrong, that it would now take a really stupid voter to miss all that. If I was a true believer, I would assert that God had to figure out some reasonable method to get rid of Trump, and this is the method that he chose, and I think it's working. Most wise, objective observers would agree that sacrificing a few 100,000 people killed, as in a world war, would still be preferable to losing America's system of government, democracy for good and all time. Undoubtedly, there are plenty of really stupid Trump voters out there, but I'm confident that Americans in general are smart enough to smell out and destroy this Trump do-nothing to eradicate or to help anyone with COVID scam, and they are also resourceful enough to defeat his vote obstruction and election frauds, I hope. Most are not buying into the frivolous and unsupported herd immunity concept they are propagating and promulgating also. Hopefully there will now be a 60-40 minimum landslide against Trump, and none of the rest of this complex stuff will have to be activated or matter much a couple months from now. The new Supreme Court Justice Barrett's deleterious effect can be obviated in 2021 if Democrats win back the Senate, as they will then pack the court the other way with 3 more liberal members to regain some sort of a just balance. I have little doubt that's exactly what they'll do if they take over both branches of the legislature, plus the executive branch in 2020 to 21. That was just a guess and a suspicion when that was written, but now they're actually talking about it now, 2-3 weeks later after this was written and thought out. This image was also quickly and detrimentally banned by Twitter, as I said, without explanation, before anyone looked at it carefully, presumably and undoubtedly under their apparent barring of all public political speech, which I guess this is. That Twitter and Facebook policy has angered many, including myself and including Trump, and prevented this from going public 2 weeks earlier. That was an additional unexpected obstruction which occurred here when I tried to do something important different. It's hard to do anything new, and it's hard to execute and get up to speed also unless you are very young. Now, rather than attempting to patch together a few liberal and other social media friends on social media where I have zero presence or interest, I'm trying this YouTube video before the election without any experience there either, or much useful intellect for doing this, and or updated technological skills necessary to act quickly here, which I'm trying to do uh, in a few hours, but it's taken a few days, and hopefully it's going all right. The overall message, wording, and scope of my huge public service digital image within the gold frame is as follows. This art's fundamentally about stopping Trump from staying on as a squatter for 4 to 12 more years, as he frequently threatens with a little laugh as though he was only kidding. However, as is fully clarified on MSNBC and the TV shows I watch, populated with ex-Trump employees such as Michael Cohen and Barbara Rez and others who know Trump well, Trump does not kid or tell jokes, and he's clearly very deadly serious about staying on as long as he can get away with it, if he can possibly, uncontroversial, do so in a somewhat close or somewhat validly contested election like smokescreen, hopefully for him. As explained in detail before, Trump absolutely needs to remain as president with Attorney General Barr as his protector, as has occurred for the last year or so, in order to avoid and at least delay his serious New York State legal, financial, and fraud problems described frequently and in detail in the press. The inferred, very serious threat of prison for himself and probably his children and or business partners or workers in the Trump organization are undoubtedly a very strong motivator for the Donald. Barr abandoned him lately is a horrible omen for Trump. Barr was arguably half of Trump's real power for the last several months, including recently, and Barr has now gone totally quiet for almost 2 months now. Viewing this art properly, the Mac desktop computer I used to create this work in Photoshop PSE with is 28 inches wide, and that is one of the better ways to see this image fully, properly, and in enough detail to recognize the several hundred prominent, well-known public faces that appear to some extent in every vignette. Now, those well-known faces are only well-known to the U.S. TV audience that watches Fox News and MSNBC and others. So there's a limited number of people perhaps that recognize all those faces. But anyway, whether this image can be viewed properly in detail on a mobile or any phone is unknown, as I do not own one or use one and haven't checked it out yet either. Trump's not that special historically. In fact, he's quite a mediocre thinker and doer and even negotiator, and he'll never be considered a great American president, obviously, any more than he's a great golfer. He will be a famous American personality, however, but in my view, infamous in American history, and certainly not a great president or even a good president. He is very smart, however, very clearly. Very smart, but far from wise, and he's not even a good, industrious, focused, and resourceful businessman, it appears. Kushner, his son-in-law, maybe, but the rest of the Trumps seem to be merely of average talent, intellect, drive, wealth, and most other American characteristics. Donald Trump doesn't fully or really understand the American political tradition and history that he's destroying now while trying to become a perpetual king, or better yet, an imperial emperor like Napoleon, Kim Un, or Putin, as I represented in my art. He wants to be a permanent authoritarian autocrat with the divine rights of ancient European kings, where his children can follow him onto the throne in due course, as represented in several vignettes. Obviously, the Trump children could never get there on their own, and I don't think they're going to get there now under the Donald either. But that predicted failure under Trump is now clearly no slam dunk and does depend on him losing the election, which I'm pretty anxious about even now, a week away. My art here is about a final judgment by voters and or God in the classical religious and artistic sense of Donald Trump himself and all of his close supporters, apologists, accomplices, accessories, co-conspirators, collaborators, criminal associates, and related allies. Trump and his illicit confederates have already fully violated and destroyed the recent established, accepted, pre-2012 or so pattern of the fully honest and forthright, unforeign influenced American election. Whereas in 2016, it's well established that the Russians, at a minimum, helped him in critical ways to get elected. Trump's quasi-mafia version of the old model is based on corruption, intimidation, self-centered crimes, and continued self-serving criminal behavior of the type numerous Trump associates have been convicted of already over the last 4 years in a totally unprecedented manner and number. Presumably, an aggressive all-Democratic Congress will be investigating and indicting Trump associates here for many years for the crimes now being committed, including blocking the mail-in vote and interfering with the post office and U.S. mails. Hopefully they will get it together and be a little more effective than they were in the impeachment proceedings, where they had a good case, but I guess it was the Republican Senate that just wasn't paying any attention to any of it. Otherwise, maybe he would have been impeached. Also requiring judgment by God, or preferably first by the next Congress, are his fellow COVID scoffers of masks, distancing, and the general severity, scope, and likely duration of the pandemic. Whether that's actionable criminal negligence or not remains to be seen. Scoffing at Noah when he was building an ark to handle an unexpected event is one thing, but intentionally or negligently making people sick at rallies now and in the midst of an ongoing, obvious, and publicized serious terminal disease to about 1/4 of the population during a universally understood epidemic may well be actionable in the future, if you ask me. This last group of horribly dangerous, tragic Trump apologists, potential military backers, and armed insurrectionists in a close or seriously contested election in a crucial battleground state are now clearly COVID-19 spreaders and potentially are executioners, at least to anyone that's over 75 years old with an underlying heart, lung, obesity, or other significant health issues. Since I have at least one of those preconditions, I take all of this deadly seriously. There are no divine rights of kings in this country. The last time that subject came up was around the War of 1812, after we fought a revolution over the issue and a civil war over different but not totally dissimilar issues. which have now been dredged up as red versus blue, as though we have brought back the dead from 150 to 75 years ago. Militants manning the polls now with guns is more of a liberal versus conservative thing than a racial thing right now. Reading the overall title, theme, and purpose of this artwork, now is the last chance to stop Trump with a peaceful election. That sums up the basic purpose of my work still. Reiterating that title may not be necessary in the actual video. When I get to scrolling the work itself, as some will object to the wasted time and unnecessary repetition here and quite excessive length of all of this narration, obviously. But most won't remember the title or understand the image, this video, or most of the narration, even if repeated multiple times. I don't do brevity very well, as length and excessive completeness is my specialty. The nice thing about making this too long is that nobody has to watch it. They can fast forward it, skip through it, or skip it entirely. But it's there for someone that might be serious about this. Therefore, if you are one of the advanced, very smart, impatient, busy viewers and listeners to this narrative and don't need the title repeated several times or the basic objectives repeated several times, and you don't need or want a lot of wordy, somewhat extraneous, explanatory narration from me, then please just skip ahead to the beginning of each image, coming up in I don't know how many minutes, but it's a little ways out still. You can just look at and appreciate the artwork without any sound or comments from me at all, and fully disregard this hour and a half or more long lecture as though this were an art gallery and you were just looking at the image as originally created on your own for a few minutes or longer. There's not normally video or narration in an art gallery, but I guess that's changing. Naturally, I will try to read all this as rapidly as I can, but I'm 79 and it's hard to get through this quickly, and it's hard to extemporize very meaningfully and to keep the speed up at the same time. But anyway, I'm reading this substantially to reduce the redundancy, but there was a time when I could do all this faster and better. This video is mostly to show the actual images at high magnification in the largest form that I have in order to clearly see the faces and to better understand all of the different hundreds of interior stories, many stories in each and every vignette. If you don't know the important faces and personalities involved in this story, like 100% of my own family don't, you're going to miss at least half of this entertainment. Similarly, non-Fox News viewers automatically, which will also be most viewers of this YouTube video, they will by default totally miss about 25% or more of the story, as the Fox News hosts and commentators are literally about half of the major villains appearing in all 19 vignettes here. They drive and motivate Trump, and without Hannity, Carlson, Ingram, Bartoloma, and a bunch of others, Trump probably wouldn't have even been elected or have survived in office without being impeached. I watch those shows, and there's a couple of them on the 5 that I watch every day are shown in that image several times. The video also gives me the opportunity to make this long, detailed, scholarly annotation for any scholars interested in that, but the central Google Drive image is still a standalone representation of this art project, and it will be exhibited in more detail in this video, more like a book than an entire wall of a fine art museum, and again in a totally different format from this video on one of my future websites, also now slowly under construction. I don't know who will be watching this video, if anyone. I also don't know exactly who needs what or who will watch this, but presumably younger viewers at some age, such as my grandkids, or perhaps their friends in different countries who do not understand anything about the American political system or Trump. A lot could be learned in this video about the American political system by some. My intention is that they and everyone will be able to understand and profit from any words and or philosophy that I add here, but many will not appreciate any narration from me or the art or my long-winded explanations of subjects and Trump Republicans and famous Fox News anchors and their loudly clamoring Trump apologists who don't know, and they don't know them and they're not interested in knowing them in the first place. Admittedly, I'm kind of old, long-winded, and I like to explain things thoroughly until they're clear to the lowest and dumbest common denominator, especially in something like this public forum, to people very deficient in American political theory and conventional ethical practice, undoubtedly. If I was teaching a fourth grade or graduate degree government class, I would probably orient this lecture and the artwork itself differently. The art was originally aimed at moral, religious, USA red state Trump voters for a couple of months, in fact, in the hopes of causing them to change their vote or risk eternal damnation in hell, presided over by Trump himself, imagined artistically as the same Satan down below that he is now to many of us up above on the Earth's USA surface. Today, 3 months later, around November 1, 2020, that initial scope is different, broader, and more generally targeted as explained. The 2020 USA national, presidential, and legislative elections and independent, contested, and highly irregular Barrett Supreme Court confirmation are all now a final judgment by voters on primarily whether they want Trump to rule absolutely during his lifetime, as I said above, like Putin, Jong-un, and other imperialistic dictators. Clarifying very briefly, Barrett is already on the Supreme Court, but if they add justices to the Supreme Court, say 13 total, then Barrett and all of Trump's conservative nominees will have been diluted down and won't have the decisive effect that they have right now. Anyway, if enough of them, the voters, legitimately do lawfully elect Trump again with the 270 electoral votes necessary, then Donald Trump Sr. will continue his chaotic, unconstitutional cult of personality, narcissistic, corrupt authoritarianism, dictatorship reign, and thereafter that corrupt, self-serving reign by force and rather clearly against the majority will of the people, despite having garnered those 270 electoral votes in a win. Still, after that, naturally, from after the Donald would flow, following the money, influence, and power, his mafia-like family and their rich supremacist supporters, false voting fraud seeking sophists, and COVID-19 pandemic, mask distancing scoffers and executioners, as explained above, would take over, and we hope that will not happen. This art is by Bruce Remington, a 2016 former Republican Trump voter, a long-time established artist in multiple media on both USA coasts, and very experienced businessman and a student. Political scientist, by the way, from a major famous Ivy League college American government school. Remington was also a conservative, former long-time top secret security holder, top secret security clearance holder at the very highly respected Research Analysis Corporation, U.S. Army think tank, and had a very extensive, successful business executive career back east, and then for 45 years in his own complex, profitable, multiple retail store and manufacturing firm with major real estate in Northern California outside of the fire zones. In other words, I, Remington, I'm not a radical liberal, and I'm still probably a Republican, but not as far as Trump is concerned. A very important issue in all this is, was Donald Trump's father real mafia or just really close to it, and or a very adept and attentive student thereof? In other words, does President Donald Trump Sr. equate closely to Michael Corleone in the Godfather films, only somewhat softer and much more of a pussy a few generations later? However, either way, Trump has now directly killed, with arguably direct responsibility, probably 10,000 people for every one documented that Don Corleone and Marlon Brando killed in the original Godfather film. That is, in my opinion, Trump is already personally responsible for at least 100,000 American deaths, and presumably he will eventually be credited with several times that. Not Hitler or Stalin maybe, but he's mentionable in the same nasty paragraph, certainly. I don't profess to know the answer to that mafia question right now, but eventually you can be sure that research by others will be done and books will be written. I love those original Godfather movies, but based more on the music and the sad, well-told story than anything else. Unfortunately, Trump does not have the music, nor should he be president to start out with, which was mostly just an accident. With no beautiful music now accompanying Trump's non-rally daily rants, except for the heavily religious music prefacing and closing some of the rallies themselves, Trump hardly measures up to the Coppola, Puzo, Godfather films. Also, now with Trump's persona and basic angry, combative mood at the two debates and rallies, for example, becoming more and more dark, untruthful, ridiculous, and pitiful in each performance, as he realizes he's almost certainly going to lose this election. The Godfather 1 analogy has become more and more distant. Trump's now more like Godfather 3, maybe. No Academy Award for this present ongoing, un-American, non-democratic, whimpering, closing clown act presentation, despite Trump's directly being on track now to cause an unprecedented several 100,000 USA deaths, it appears. Incidentally, actually, for what it's worth, I like Trump even now, and I've liked him in many ways all along. I listen to many of his speeches. That's why I can do this effectively. I've listened to some of his rallies and regularly, and subjected myself to his apologists on the 5 and Fox News. I don't watch Fox News much anymore, but I do record some of the shows and erase them, but I could watch them. I can admit that I voted for him in 2016, as did many other lawyers, professionals, and smart people, because he was the lesser of the evils who would inferentially produce a stronger, less continuously divisive, and more harmonious country than Hillary Clinton. But not quite. We were very wrong about that, that's for sure. Unfortunately, the latter expected Trumpian harmony never worked out, very far from it, as the impeachment and criminal scandal controversies have been 10 times worse than Hillary ever could have been, and the former stronger economy was totally undone by COVID, plus the relentless criminal investigations against Trump and 100% of his associates at all levels of federal and even state governmental organization, and they continue. And they will continue after he's out of office, too. In 2016, I absolutely could not take 4 more years of Clinton scandals and problems, but Trump has been drastically worse and uses up all of the public oxygen in this country all day, every day, with one problem, scandal, ridiculous lie, or absurdity after another, daily without fail. Now almost most people would agree that he's totally unacceptable even for the next 4 weeks, let alone 4 years. He's been very entertaining, without a doubt, but the act has now completely worn out. For me, and I think most people, and 4 more days of it will now be intolerable for all of us. Political TV will be dull under Biden, no doubt, but that will be very welcome for a while at least. This art, video, and digital image is about the COVID pandemic non-response more than anything else, at least if Trump leaves in an election defeat, which localized outbreaks of COVID are now increasing exponentially again in every state except Oregon in late October 2020. COVID's important. However, if Trump refuses to leave after a legitimate election loss, then that would be the worst single event in American history, in my opinion. And new artwork will have to be created to explain and understand its grave historical ramifications for our country and system of government. That would be too catastrophic to get into here, hypothetically. Some sickness and deaths were obviously unavoidable in a pandemic. However, purgatory and similar final judgment retribution somewhere by whatever forces may be available there or from the U.S. Congress and state courts next year will determine if some personal negligence is involved by Trump and is supporting evil, immoral people and or their souls. Plenty of imaginable juries could find criminal negligence on the part of Trump and his administration, I have no doubt. Aside from COVID, obviously there are other racial issues. Immigrant children at the border being separated from their mothers while breastfeeding and put in cages. And there's the personal graft of all of the Trump family and their immoral business dealings, the obvious totally immoral, unlawful intermingling of personal and public finances and non-payment of taxes. And there's the incredible number of powerful and extremely close to Trump himself indictments of numerous top administrative officials throughout his administration, ranging from Manafort and Gates to Flynn and Stone and all the others that have been in the news for 4 years now. See number 9 and number 10 images where all of those issues and many more are specifically represented in the art. whether God or our U.S. legal system will punish the Trumps for their obvious flagrant violation of norms and numerous financial, loan, and bribery laws with either prison or similar eternal or short-term damnation in various conventional above-ground prisons is not known at this time. However, unless God likes, condones, and specifically pardons stealing money, building walls, using cages for human children, corruption, obstructing the postal service, serial lying and blatant tax avoidance, evasion and fraud, etc., it would appear that the Trumps are at a minimum in some grave jeopardy from the U.S. justice system, with substantial measurable risk to all of them right now. Barr and Durham are not going to bail Trump out now, as it seemed at one point they might before the election or any time, it appears. That was in doubt when I started this work almost 3 months ago, and it is a relief that both Barr and Durham have bowed out of all this for the moment, and now was the moment. If they were going to do anything, they would have. Very substantial time and research went into these 19 separate numbered vignettes in this huge digital artwork, which is over 500 million pixels in PSE. It's a massive work, plus 2 unnumbered panels between the frames involving guardian warrior angels like St. Michael. Those good angels dispatched millions of souls and Trump supporters to hell, as represented symbolically in the margins of both frames to the right and left of the images. Now getting to the substance of this art and taking the numbered frames one by one in numerical order, we start. The first image shown here is number 1 by Stephen Lochner, Last Judgment, circa 1435. That background artwork is now shown as the highest and centered image in the large gold frame, and is thus an appropriate place to start. This widely celebrated image portrays Jesus, Mary, and St. John, with Jesus blessing those multitudes, rising to heaven with his right hand, while condemning those sinners condemned to hell with his left. There will be other closer up versions of this coming up. Reasons for selling one's soul to the devil are still just as provocative, intriguing, and important today as they have always been throughout history, especially when a president, and hopefully former president, is incriminatingly involved. This vignette number 2 portrays angels and demons killing people either in heaven or on the mountaintops or some other higher surfaces of the land. Therefore, bodies and souls of the earth's surface or from above that are seen there cascading down from higher plateaus by the millions, down cliffs worldwide, and not just in the U.S., from the red states and or Washington, D.C. My art accurately depicts those souls here falling into the famous Styx River and similar water or tunnel paths to Hades. The Styx, that's S-T-Y-X, is reputed to run into the underworld and to hell itself, which details are portrayed in some detail within most vignettes. Many of the deaths portrayed here are COVID deaths, and whether those bodies and souls will wind up in heaven or hell is beyond the scope of this mere artwork. One could speculate, though, that many of them, if not most, will not be ultimately judged by God or whoever does that sort of thing as evil and very bad, so as to wind up in an internal, expected, and justified purgatory under Trump within hell itself. How did Trump get in charge of hell, one might wonder? He claims to be a good negotiator, and maybe that's true. And he also claimed to be the chosen one, And he was certainly number 3, Rubens' Final Judgment, large masterpiece, close-ups of people's souls damned by God and cast back to earth and into hell by God's angels, as portrayed here at the top and in the sides of the frame. Those forces of good on high are now rather appropriately symbolically represented by Biden, whereas Trump's present hell on earth will probably continue below ground and within Trump himself for as long as he maintains any identifiable consciousness. And incidentally, this is a very long narrative, admittedly, and you did not have to listen to it, all of it. You can just look at the art as was intended, and as a screenshot on direct drive, or you can look at it quickly on YouTube in a few minutes. And the narrative could be over 90 minutes. I don't even know yet, but some people might enjoy it and some people not, but the art was originally intended to be looked at as stills. Anyway, continuing on as fast as I can, my thesis here in number 3 is that many of those internally damned minions and Trump allies will be Trump supporters and armed backers thereof, Fox News paid personality pundits who have to support the network's propaganda, etc. However, many Fox hosts do not obnoxiously and irrationally trumpet Trump's lies and false COVID and related statements and or worship and echo members of Trump's own family as though they were gods themselves. Thus, barely 15% of Fox's major commentators are portrayed here, because most of them are not propagandists like the ones listed here. However, many familiar political faces are identified easily here, including frequently Trump, the big guy himself, in various personifications, mood, variations, forms, satirical memes, and grotesque medieval devil personifications and expansive mouth of hell Photoshop liquefations, none of which seem especially cruel or unsuitable considering the present massive COVID crisis, hundreds of thousands of deaths, and the increasing racial and civil economic unrest, and the hugely important and dastardly intentional postal chaos preventing the voting by mail responses and killing a lot of people in the process, and similar public Trump themes and intentional illicit and or corrupt pandemonium caused here. And in that regard, almost every Trump image is an actual photograph, but there's a few exceptions. Anyway, this chaos in the U.S. mail system is especially problematic right now because it was caused intentionally and largely from removing about 100 automated mail sorters in the most crucial swing states and simultaneously intentionally slowing down all the mail so as to fundamentally and deliberately obstruct the timing of mail-in ballots in order to make them too statutory late to be counted. Absolutely, that cannot be underestimated here. It's also true, he's admitted it, and I'm not going to document all the facts and evidence in this overly long narrative. Anyway, thanks to the Supreme Court, in part, most states now require all mail-in ballots to actually be received at the polling places by November 3rd and not just postmarked before them. And I say thanks cynically. It did not help the American system much. That presents an enormous problem, mostly forces more than 100 million voters to vote in person and or also to drop their ballots off in person, oblivious of the mails, and trust the drop boxes maybe. That problem has been noted peripherally since August, but my own only very late October major revision of vignettes number 9 and 10 substantially did look at this issue again, almost only, and involving this mailing disaster in the middle of a deadly pandemic. Very serious. I take it very seriously, and I've addressed it very seriously in my work here. Hopefully that mailing issue will remain the largest single problem here with Trump, because the election hopefully will be a big enough landslide that he will not have the courage, audacity, or any grounds whatsoever for remaining in the presidency with a minority of the electoral votes, i.e. less than 270. In other words, my and others like Bill Mayer, etc., biggest fear has been that he will not win the election fairly, or the Electoral College's requisite 270 votes, but he will legally contest enough states with some meager validity and then get the probably unobjective Supreme Court sycophantic judges that he has appointed, 3 of which now, to back him up in one or more significant enough lawsuit that he can somehow remain as president. That would pose an unprecedented constitutional crisis, which probably could only be resolved by the Congress, all in Democratic hands, and the Supreme Court's name mostly out of it, and the military refusing to back Trump. All of the various nasty and horrible scenarios that could play out are well beyond the scope of this artwork, and hopefully will be beyond the scope of the next artwork on this topic, if any. Also in number 3, as well as number 2, there will obviously be many sick, dismembered, and dead Trump supporters and enablers that are recognizable if the present situation and terrible COVID and other Trump corrupt actions and events are just projected out a short distance in time. Many famous medieval and later artists were used in this number 3 vignette, and many other of these vignettes also included here. In this one are Luca, Signorelli, Rubens, Small Judgments also in here, Madonna Delato by Jacoba Tintoretto, Worship of Golden Calf, and Last Judgment, Michelangelo's Damned Bodies. Stephen Lochner again is used in a lot of these. J. Cousin 2's Last Judgment, Jan Bruegel's miscellaneous brilliant on-topic works are used throughout. Jacob Jordan's Hans Memling, Last Judgment, is used fairly frequently in this thing. Alta Pinco Neck, Franz Franken, Damned Cast into Hell, Jan van Eyck is seen in here often, etc. I had considered pointing out the different personalities reflected in number 3. I could go around with a pointer, but I don't have the electronic capability here right now, nor would it be necessary, very useful or interesting. Someone well versed in the administrative spokesman, Fox News hosts, and all the major important controversial politicians are very prominently featured in the news during the second half of 2020, and they're all emphasized and covered here, and they'd be recognizable to anyone that really appreciates this art, and anyone that is going to get more than a few minutes of vicarious enjoyment or confusion from this work will recognize most of those people. Candidly, this work is only oriented towards serious political thinkers, wise pundits, and active political movers in this country. I could put a huge pointer on my mouse, and I've experimented with it, and point out all 50 or 60 famous faces in just this one vignette alone, but I've decided in the interest of time, efficiency, and pointlessness of that endeavor at this time to not do that. If 100 people request or demand it, I could rather easily do it in a few hours, but there are even 5 to 10 faces which I used and I know were important political spokesmen, which I can't even remember the names of now or the angles used, and they're upside down or diagonal, and would have to look back at my files or notes to find a few of them myself. and locate them but they came from news images and then individually were removed in Photoshop, resized and repeatedly resized, and it all takes quite a bit of time and difficulty, although I got very quick at it. Also, some pictures varied a little bit from the normal, and some images of them of both sexes are a little hard to recall or tell, even for me. I do absolutely guarantee, however, that every clear, recognizable image in this entire artwork is a famous, important political figure supporting Trump before and still, who I knew very clearly who they were when they were put in there, but some of them were put 2 or 3 months ago. Whistleblowers and anyone remotely ambiguous or somewhat equivocal in their support of the big man did not make this artwork. The fact that they're heroes, and so there are thousands of people that are in the Trump administration that are not in here, obviously. As for Diablo, Mephistopheles, and the devil, Trump's face fits in uncannily well into all of the images that I found from the Middle Ages, which makes me think that Trump will fit right into hell really well as a demon-like middle manager, as part of his hypothesized selling his soul bargain, just as naturally as he does into most of these images herein. Some of the blends are so perfect that I've marveled myself at times that they appear to be masterpieces, at least to me. And Trump seemed to have grown that way. I now have to try to pause this again. Number 4, Great Falls of the Styx lead to eternal damnation in hell of evil humans, living and dead. This is inspired by Door again, but entirely my own background composition. Legitimately, it could be argued that the position of some of these artworks from 1 to 19 are somewhat chaotic in their organizational order. The reasons for that are not important, but after the first 2 large images, number 2, 3, extended from the left into the center, the next major image, number 4, is back on the left side again, with a number of the next images, number 5 through 8, extending out towards the center. Number 9 to 12 occupy the upper right quadrant, whereas the other 7 are below that. Part of the reason for that is that I had originally projected only 6 to 7 at the most images, but the number and subject matter grew drastically as I continued getting deeper into the work. Putting them into the frame emphasizes that odd arrangement, which is why they're all prominently and largely numbered now, so you can get them in the right order. Plus, they all have captions. But putting these 19 plus side frame images one by one into a YouTube video should ameliorate that problem completely, especially once it's explained and emphasized here. Gustave Doré is the great French pen artist and wood engraver. He was inspired by Dante Alighieri's Inferno and Charon, and did more than 50 illustrations for his famous book about hell, including herding sinners onto his boat into hell, etc. Doré provided some of the basic inspiration for the river Styx, the idea of rapids in the first place and various boats and their bodies floating in the raging waters, both dead and near dead, towards or within hell, including braving these impossible Class 6 plus rapids and waterfalls, or at least being drowned going down them. There are some recognizable faces nearest to the camera, but most boats and most swimmers did not survive the great falls and turbulent waters, and thus many souls and bodies reached hell floating near death and clinging to individual boat wreckage, etc., as portrayed in my number 4 to 6, or they were just dead already, but still buoyant enough to float. Even if only 1 in 100 survive, there are still thousands and perhaps millions of poor tortured and or evil souls still populating these vignettes of hell, illustrated herein and essentially copied by me from other encyclopedic and authoritative works on the subject, since I've never been there myself. The primary historic 17th to 19th century ship art used by me, including ships overturning and capsizing and the famous paintings realistically depicting wave turbulence here, were by Theodore Gudin, 3 different ones, William Turner, Claude Vernet, Rembrandt, and John Carmichael, and several others, plus some photographs of actual contemporary 20th century ships overfilled with migrants that I then overturned in my Photoshop artwork. This is a real short one here, number 5, with Biden in the boat surveying things. This was inspired again by Dorr, and it is again from Dante's Divine Comedy, Inferno, Canto. Biden is portrayed here as the Virgil-like stabilizing and calming figure in Dante's boat in the Dorr illustration called Phlegus ferries Dante and Virgil across the swamp of the Styx. Note also the Stradano-related illustration in the back section across the bloody waters with solid dead bodies piling up on every shore and everywhere. This is another very short one, number 6, entitled Trump and Hicks World Survey Notices No Problems, give themselves an A+ on COVID, and deny it is significant. Was Trump chosen to live so far by God or a pact with the devil? This artwork addresses all of that. The work itself is by Gustav Dorr again. He did the basic background, and in his masterful illustration in the book we've been talking about, all I had to do was add a few further details, some color, a nasty looking upset Trump head or torso, almost as though he'd been expecting to be managing something in heaven and not with all these contemptible Trump supporters down below that he admittedly detests. Standing beside him is one of his oldest and best primary enablers, Hicks. Anyway, Dorr's masterpiece illustrations here were a great artistic and commercial success when they were created, and they are quite brilliant in their incisive details. This is one of the 3 or 4 most complicated ones here, number 7. The basic background painting used here is entitled The Harrowing of Hell by Jacob van Swanenberg, but I took extreme license with that. Also featured prominently in the fiery backgrounds and people incinerators in the upper parts of the image was a painting called Hell by Hieronymus Bosch, 1550. My very complex digital blended collage artwork number 7 could have been broken into 5 or more large major images that I had ready to use, but wanted to cram into this one frame format because the large gold frame was already overfilled, resulting in this somewhat excessively busy composition. Number 7 is numerous other elements ranging from 2 3-headed dogs of hell to the throned Emperor Trump as the chosen one, who also is a multiple headliner here, starring also as one of the primary and largest expanded, real liquefied in Photoshop mouths of hell in the lower right-hand corner. I'm going to go over some of the elements here, but you really need to look at this yourself in detail if you're interested. In other words, this large mouth of hell in the lower right-hand corner is literally Trump's real photographed mouth, expanded large enough here to fit and hold the contents added. Other prominent elements include very prominently featured at the right edge are 2 different sections from La Brique, Chapelle, Notre Dame des Fontaines, Fresque du Judgment, Dernier, and their acclaimed wall murals. A third portion of that brilliant, upsetting, grotesque altar work is on the left side of the image, highlighted in purple. Note directly to the left of His Excellency Premier Trump is a troubling artwork of the woman with more than 20 arrows stuck in her body, and continuing, the pincushion lady with more arrows still being shot until her painful death. The title of that art is called Bellison and Canivizio, which is the main altar in the Chapelle Saint Sebastian, France. Third, other Hell's Mouth portrayals, 4 total here, plus an immense number of other artistic details everywhere, include 2 other medieval classic versions by uncredited masters behind Trump's throne and the Bellesian pincushion woman, plus Trump's already discussed Photoshop liquefied mouth in the lower right-hand corner, filled with additional contents from La Brique. 4. Note the several Perosier details from a triptych in Monster Brain by Georgius Klantzas. 5. Note Melania Trump in Purgatory, and Kushner and Hannity and a bunch of others serving their Dark Lord well as active demons. Next, a grotesque medieval torturous skinning of McConnell in the lower left-hand corner is based on famous medieval source material in my files, as are all numerous other details present but not specifically pointed out and discussed herein. All I had to do in many of these cases was just to add a head. The interesting chariot of a fat fat Trump seated beside the sun god crossing the sky in the upper horizon was originally from the image in Anus in the Underworld, Charon's Boat by Jacob van Swanenberg, and quite a lot of that masterpiece painting is used throughout and in several of these 19 numbered works. Number 8. Losing battles between Trump's supremacists, their souls and Satan's devils and angels here escalate in purgatory. The brilliant, versatile, famous Jan Bruegel the Elder painted the basic background here entitled Christ in Limbo in 1593. I made over 100 substantial modifications, however, to suit my themes, including running orange lava and related overt, hot, flaming, fiery pictures of hell under the bridge, with hundreds of bodies being thrown off it into the fiery lava by various demons. I therefore changed the entire character of the painting by increasing the amount of orange and yellow fire and flames in the sky and on the ground and everywhere, and generally by adding substantial, realistic present-day chaos to the scene, including dozens thrown off the bridge to their fiery death. I also added numerous publicly recognizable Trump backers and well-known TV sympathizers in the foreground, which again draws substantially on Swanberg's Charon's Boat in the lowest center section. Featured on the crest of the important stone bridge across the lava fields is a seminal monster from hell, here an excellent large monster on the bridge, chosen from at least 10 other possibilities from the video games Civil War and Hades, etc. There are many other important details in this image, horrible violent demons and monsters, plus plenty of very public Trump backers and or villains interspersed and featured in this prominent vignette number 8 depicting hell itself. Number 9 is one of the really complicated ones, so it takes a little longer than some. Anyway, the Trump-caused chaos, pandemonium, misery on the Earth's surface continues directly and proportionally into hell itself, which is all portrayed here in some detail and also in vignette number 10 that follows. The title of this art image and the plentiful captions involving voting irregularities, suffering, and dying during this pandemic, and the other 2020 corruption and violence problems experienced today accurately capture and separate any meaning from those of Bosch, probably during a plague 450 years ago. The title of this is Racial and Police Violence, Immorality, Corruption, Bribery, Lying, Tax Fraud, Russian Extreme Irregularities, Undermining the Election Stability, White House Staff, Devastated by COVID Without Masks, etc. continues when that was originally written on October 1st. Since then it's been edited. The basis for my pretty strong direct attack on Trump and his very anti-democratic voting election and representative policies is the famous painting by a follower of Jeronius Bosch entitled Christ in Limbo, created about 1575. Whether Bosch himself was alive or participated in this art in any way is unknown. I merely used it as a background and added many words. Contemporary 2020 political election and financial corruption, health pandemic, and civil and racial unrest in the city type problems to the pandemonium that was apparently also present in the 16th century, just different. This and also number 10 were the last two images that were upgraded here on October 28th, 2020 to reflect the extreme election irregularities and obstacles presented by Trump to voting by mail recently during a pandemic, plus the enormous COVID exponential rises all across the country happening right now in the last week of October, causing enormous other uncertainties and irregularities during this last few days of the month, which I thought should be made a part of this art for history, if nothing else. So I added a bunch of probably mostly election-related stuff. I also had originally added many recognizable 2020 characters through their heads here into number 10, plus the literally dozens of other details throughout the work if one actually studies it at high magnification. All heads used in this work were at a minimum of infamous or negatively mentioned in the news at least a month or two of that before or concurrently with when this art was created in early fall 2020 mostly. The words embedded in the artwork itself best capture the spirit and meaning of the work, generally on the exact day that it was created, as even the main caption added a week or more later is only a generalized summary of what that complicated artwork is or was really about, based mostly on the TV news events that were on 4 to 5 channels all day every day during 2020. Those stories involved racial and police violence, some individual grotesque murders of blacks by police, and generally the nationally publicized, usually very unwarranted and or unnecessary killing of various black men and women every week or two. Some of that violence caused counter-reactions, rioting, arson, and looting in a few large American cities, reflected here in the art generally. Also the immense immorality throughout the government involving rather blatant financial corruption, overt bribery, continuous lying on all subjects by Trump's sole regular spokesman and mostly by himself. Other corruption and immorality from the top echelon of Washington included without limitation. Rather blatant tax fraud and gross underpayments of taxes, bribery, and other obvious financial irregularities involving the Trump business interests like hotels by Donald Trump Sr., especially as reported on the liberal TV networks, plus the extreme irregularities undermining the 2020 election and vote counting ever since the Russian Wiki Twitter assistance in 2016 and the massive criminal and aberrant behavior summarized in the Mueller report, including primarily the impeachment proceedings centered on the Ukraine attempted bribery for false information on Joe Biden and his sons to enable the unpopular Trump to retain the presidency by illicit corrupt means. All those scandals and more have now been revived in 2020 by Trump himself and or the Democrats, with new threats of Russia and Iranian involvement, intimidation threats, and other adverse influence now in the news almost daily, at least through the election, which is now less than 10 days from today. The massive outbreaks of COVID-19 within the White House and after most Trump rallies have made a virtual laughingstock and skeleton crew, literally, of workers at the White House, with very few network or magazine reporters, for the most part, having the courage to even go near the place anymore. Trump and Pence staff in particular have been just devastated. A lot of that would all be because of the Trump-led White House's refusal to use and demand masks or social distancing consistently or properly enough to ensure everyone's safety and protection 100% of the time from the virus. Additionally, as captioned in my parody art and stenciled on the red Trump hat itself, saying, "Make Democrats very sick again." That's from Make America Great Again. And I also say, "Destroy vote by mail." Those are enormous problems we are contending with right now. Also, the sign above Trump, from which some of his most serious and disturbing remarks and plans were paraphrased, "Make Trump president for life by divine right," is a deadly serious matter right now and over the next week. Revolutions and civil wars have been fought in other countries over less than that. Trump has jokingly said as much, but it has been thoroughly documented that Trump does not joke. His major Washington, plus other international hotels, offer obvious, plentifully used and abused occasions for bribery, and different countries or wealthy interests take advantage of the opportunity to purchase favors by paying large amounts of cash for large amounts of rooms for long stays in exchange for numerous other presidential favors of which we do not yet know all the details at the present time. Someday we'll probably find out about it. Trump himself said that he doesn't want any voting to take place at all by anyone. That tells us all we need to know completely, candidly about his corrupt position. He has volunteered and informed us that he has the time and the interest to just stay on indefinitely in the presidency without worrying us any further about democracy, voting for him or against him, or especially about Democrats trying to vote through the mails to avoid dying from COVID. If nobody votes as he has requested, then he will gladly just volunteer to remain president by de facto circumstances. At this writing in late October 2020, with Trump down 2 to 15 points nationally, including by significant amounts in most of the crucial swing states that he won easily in 2016, it appears that just staying on by force as a squatter is now the only way Trump can remain as president after January 2021. That is now a horrendous fear for millions of us in this country during the last week before November 3, and is one of the main reasons I'm doing this at all. What a disastrous mistake for this country back in 2016 when we voted for Trump and his clan, but he was familiar and seemed innocent and innocuous enough initially, and we wanted a change, and we certainly got one. Now, it could be argued that the office changed him for the worst, and in any case, he has now turned into a monster which maybe he was all along and maybe not. It's not that relevant now, as he must go either way. Various caricatures in my art feature the very lazy, obese, and obsequious to Putin, President Trump, and various recognizable Fox TV personalities are also everywhere. Most of them are well known to the USA TV audience and crucial to this present aberrant presidency. And they are very arguably the primary reason that public opinion has not turned 100% against Trump because of Fox News' continuous drumbeat of largely false but rather intelligent and well-presented Trump propaganda against all his enemies. In other words, Fox is absolutely crucial to Trump remaining in office, and in my view, it is they that keep him in office essentially, but hopefully that's now coming to an end. It now seems possible that Biden could get a substantial enough majority, especially in Florida, especially perhaps early on election night, in order to avoid a very protracted, nastily contested election, possible violent mob action, and numerous unreliable, contested, and litigated recounts that no one would trust and few would eventually be happy and contented with. 2 more mouths of hell are featured here in this work, plus chaos, pandemonium, torture, and suffering everywhere, constant, largely irrelevant Trump propaganda, distractions all day long, every day, by Trump personally, both here on earth and there in hell. Also, my art portrays the obvious rampant corruption, massive widespread misery, torture, economic hardships, and great pain throughout the country, experienced by many, but not necessarily most of us, as there is still very considerable wealth and resourcefulness in the country, and the ability to work remotely by computer and telephone is presently saving the world economy and perhaps half of the people in it. But increasingly, discomfort, hardship, pandemic, sickness, and death is now increasing exponentially as winter comes on and COVID cases rise with no vaccination or cures yet realistically in sight. The prominent, hauntingly true caricature of Putin riding and controlling an obese and totally docile, obedient Trump from his back is a featured cartoon-like summary of Trump and the USA's relationship with Russia over the last several years. I did not create that brilliant caricature, but merely reproduce it here. Russia, too, has their problems with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has impacted the stupider, more complacent, cocky USA even more, with uncomfortable coronavirus sickness now extending through the White House into both the presidency and the vice president's immediate staff, plus the president's family itself, reducing the entire. Number 10, The Triumph of Death, or here renamed by me, The Triumph of COVID over Trump, was originally masterfully painted by Bruegel the Elder in 1562, then augmented and crudely and hurriedly updated to convey the present catastrophes by me in about September 2020. As one of the top 7 most detailed intensive artworks in this collection, there are again literally hundreds of facial expressions, recognizable heads, odd and calamitous, understandable stories and circumstances, and related details to study upon close inspection of this art, preferably at high clear magnification. All of the skeletons present were originally put there by Bruegel to represent fear, rampant death, and the dire consequences of the plagues that were devastating Europe at the time. Now, COVID is doing almost the same thing, if not as direly and hopelessly, with modern hospitals, understood medical science, clear microscopic visibility of the enemy, ventilators, masks, potential vaccines to assist us and save our lives today. In other words, this Bruegel painting makes a great background because the situation was actually substantially worse back then, as we very clearly had better prospects for living overall than they did in the Middle Ages. Probably the people were tougher then, and we are more spoiled now and expecting 100% quick cures much more painlessly and pleasurably than in 1560. To anyone that has listened for a while to the desperate and tired nurses and doctors on CNN and MSNBC, etc., who are already tired from fighting the pandemic as it just now begins to frighteningly escalate exponentially, one could easily think that things are worse today than back in 1500, but I think that's unlikely. Things are very bad today. Many are tired and many will die, but few would voluntarily agree to change places medically or emotionally today with a plague patient in a medieval hospital, if they had such, with all the modern equipment, medicines, well-trained staff, in sterile clothes and masks we have now, and very significantly the prospects for a vaccine in the foreseeable future are prominently and believably out there. A year from now, it's more likely than not that we will be inoculated and substantially free from this new plague for a while. In 1500, the fear was more extreme, and there could hardly have been any grounds for hope at all. Either way, the skeletons then and now are running out of time, as life is just as precarious now, probably more so for older people, as it may have been back in the 16th century for the younger people then. Younger people in all ages were seriously threatened in the 16th century, whereas probably half of the younger people today are not threatened that severely, making this 21st century threat primarily a threat and a fear to the older half of the population only. That is, then everyone had to fear for their life all day and night every day in 1560. But now it is primarily people over 70 in poor health and certain minorities with health issues, but most all others have a substantial hope or even no fear at all, and a quite high probability of rolling the dice successfully and remaining alive. Many other prominent features of my vignette, which possibly require some explanation, are the Escher perspective anomaly art, symbolizing Trump's fantastic lie-created unreal world based largely on his ridiculous fabricated lies he does not believe himself, that COVID-19 will all one day just magically disappear in the near term. Obviously, it will be gone someday, but his statements always referred to a month or two away when it warmed up, etc. He told Bob Woodward as much, that he was just trying to avoid a panic, so he lied. Unfortunately, it's not gone away at all, but has gotten much worse. It is now completely clear that those absurd Trump statements were merely an intentional self-serving lie all along, just so that people would re-elect him for another 4 years of COVID neglect and likely several million more deaths. Around November 1st, 2020, COVID is now increasing sharply and geometrically every day. Right now, meaning it is often doubling in cases and deaths every 1 to 2 weeks in many places, probably most places as of this video. Also, the majority of the hospitals in the country are at or nearly at capacity, with a new Russian computer ransomware virus even now attacking many hospitals, and also showing a possible ominous potential of harming and or affecting state election systems and vote counting in a few days. Burning ballots is also symbolic of Trump's attempt to claim that non-existent fraudulent destruction of Trump ballots was already happening various places in the U.S., everywhere. So Trump and his criminal accomplices decided to counteract that by preventing the post office from being able to deliver any mail at all properly. Trump especially blocked all timely COVID-fearing Democratic mail-in ballots at strategically large cities with Democratic voters before various state counting deadlines in the 4 to 5 most crucial swing states and their cities, including Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Arizona, and a few others. All mail delivery in some of those states' largest cities has now been slowed by 50%. A federal judge today even attempted to intercede to resume normal service and to expedite ballot pickup and deliveries, but only 2 working days before the election is way too little, way too late. Overtly tampering with the national election vote is unprecedented in this country and is so illegal that it should be worthy of the death penalty on the premeditated scale done here, especially when committed by a divine right of kings want to be. However, right now, it's not any type of major prosecutable federal crime, and hopefully it will eventually be prosecutable as a felony when facts and proofs are gathered. Plenty of wars and deaths have occurred throughout history over despots trying to take power illicitly, illegally, and by force. Hopefully the American character is still strong enough to oppose a tyrant the way we did successfully in 1776. The various fires on the horizon of number 10 symbolize and represent the arson of various cities such as Portland, Seattle, and Philadelphia recently. Fires also symbolize the unprecedented 2020 burning of California due to the apparently unprecedented increasing dryness in the California forests and brush because of slight climate temperature increases, reduced rain, and inopportune increased wind at times. As a result, now any small California fire with any wind whatsoever can often quickly burn hundreds of thousands of acres very quickly and or before meaningful control measures can be taken. The Fragonard swing small excerpt burning symbolizes the loss under Trump and COVID of carefree, relaxed, affluent pleasures and dreams that Americans have enjoyed and likewise assumed would always be available to them for at least the last 100 years. That assumed and clearly taken for granted, probably historically unprecedented relaxed pleasure for so many people experienced by the over 100 to 200 million people making up the majority of the USA. That idyllic, relaxed, financially prosperous paradise-like pleasure may have now been permanently jeopardized and substantially lost forever, at least for 100 million USA people under Trump. Whether that relaxed leisure and idyllic, comfortable pleasure will now ever be fully regained after COVID is hopefully and presumably fully vanquished under a new president is now unknown. Possible economic and sociological reasons for that are because the breaches between rich and poor, black and white, southern and northern, red and blue states may have become too dissociated, untethered, disorganized, and let out of the box, so to speak, now to be neatly put back into place with all the 50-some states and territories harmoniously in step, as was the case previously before COVID and perhaps before Trump. There are many other thoughtful elements and clear details in this work, including the Biden hanging by Trump on the right corner, literally, if Trump had prevailed in the Durham probe, which was very much hanging in the balance and substantially in doubt at the time that number 10 art was drafted by me. See also the diptych crucifixion detail, also in the upper right, as well as the little vignette on the upper left under the tolling bell of fate of border cages where children were intentionally separated from their parents to send all possible immigrants a very serious message, which worked. But no other presidency before Trump would have even thought to handle the situation that way, let alone execute it by removing breastfeeding babies from their mothers and then losing the children and permanently separating the families. Although Biden has promised to attempt to undo that damage, but that may not now be possible and will then open up the floodgates to thousands more unwanted immigrants and their children, which have now been reduced to manageable proportions at the moment. Death is totally rampant in number 10, and dead bodies are piled up everywhere as the primary skeleton of death, with the huge scythe at the lower center, now obscured in a cloud of green COVID germs, rides on horseback, slaying everyone in his path. Meanwhile, other wagons operated by the dead enter demons run indiscriminately over anything infirm in their path, with the green COVID germs spread everywhere, sickening and are killing many in their path who are susceptible or who have unknown pre-existing conditions dictated mysteriously by fate. Some being killed by the green COVID virus from the skeleton on the horse are in the long lines waiting to vote in person due to Trump's blatant criminal sabotaging of the U.S. Post Office, which previously, before removing the automated sorters and receiving severe slowdown orders, it could have gotten all ballots where they needed to go to be counted in days or hours rather than months or never. Other elements in number 10 worthy of comment are: 1, a reproduction of the famous painting The Scream by Munch; 2, Trump's infamous false lying quote that COVID is a fake virus; 3, someone famously saying, "We are young," as they lay in the hospital dying, explaining why they hadn't worried about masks, distancing, or getting sick, and therefore they were negligently complacent in thinking they had nothing to fear from COVID because they were young. 4, Trump is again portrayed as king in the lower left with crown, royal attire, and ill-gotten wealth as he lies there dying of the plague anyway, despite his fame and fortune and probable bargain with the devil when he was last in the hospital dying of COVID. Won't he be surprised when he sees that you can get covert twice at some point in the near future? 5, the convicted felon Flynn, who's still not in, I don't think he's in jail yet, is a knight still trying valiantly and successfully to help out his mentor Trump. And 6, Pence and Giuliani are accurately portrayed down at the bottom there, lying there, slowly dying COVID victims, where they both will eventually probably wind up. Of course, we hope not and don't wish such a death on anyone, but real predictions have no room for hypocritical or polite sentiment. Pence was the head of the entire government's COVID responsive task force, but by ignoring his own rules flagrantly, he has now been recently severely exposed, and his entire staff is sick and out of the office. So far, he has still miraculously survived somehow, raising the question in my mind, also of whether he too made a pact with the same devil that Trump inferentially successfully negotiated with, naturally, with various other ape-like traditional medieval Satan manifestations in these last 9 artworks, which I was constantly astounded to see. If Trump is not really Satan himself now here on earth, he certainly could easily fool you and me and believably impersonate the devil anywhere, including in my art, as he certainly blends in naturally and believably with the medieval versions thereof from over 500. Number 12, Fra Angelico's Last Judgment was created in 1031. My modified update was executed in September 2020 involving COVID, all the other sins and detriment described herein, in addition to the gross immorality, criminality, corruption, and generally bad governing of the Trump administration. The original was likely more focused on human immorality, religious differences and persecutions, evil, plus the plague when it was originally created 1,000 years ago. Friar John Angelico was reputed to be a rare and perfect talent, an exceptional painter even before he joined the church, and worked for many years on religious artworks around Italy. Hans Memling's Last Judgment is also involved here in cameo roles and minor cloned modifications in my updating in 2020 recapitulation honoring of Fra Angelico. Similarly, Giotto di Bandoni's Last Judgment provided a few extra characters, bodies, details, cauldrons, and fires to fit my modified design conception and the very numerous contemporary evil Trump administration Fox and other outside collaborators. Number 13 was by Francesca Traini to Trinfo della Morte, circa 1325 to 30, installed on a Pisa wall of a church. This green metallic armored devil, now taken over, engulfed, fully subsumed in body, spirit, and demonic cunning by Trump's head, body, persona, and spirit in this artwork, clearly dominates this portion of hell where he's being represented. Although his face is always sweating somewhat in hell, the same as most of his photographs on earth, it is not sweating as much as one would expect in those 1,000+ degree Fahrenheit fires, so he has adapted admirably. What a man. Here's a traditional medieval multiple-mouthed demon, Satan style. Trump is happily consuming some of the damned souls, many of which were bodies of his supporters, plus others who voted for Biden. Next, in traditional medieval fashion, Trump is reincarnating some of those bodies and spirits, like the opposite of his abortion views, which is somehow symbolic of the present recent Barrett Supreme Court Justice battle. Meanwhile, other figures in his own and chief supporters' images serve capably as armies of demons in hell to help effectively dispatch the devil's work of torture and inflicting misery on the living and dead. Number 14 is a short narrative, and the artwork is by Giotto di Bandoni, who provided the brilliant inspiration for this background, which is his famous Last Judgment detail on an Italian church wall done around 1306. Some of the other elements beyond Trump's uncanny Photoshop transfiguration into the devil were provided by Cappella di Sovigna, Padua. Number 15 is the Hortus Delicarum hell depiction from 1180 by a rare female religious author and artist at that time. This illustration was part of a manuscript by Harold of Landsberg and created in all of its sordid, painful, and gruesome detail in France. These disturbing images are really no worse than the terror and pain caused today to many in and out of the hospital by COVID and Trump's non-reaction to all of the massive resurgence of the COVID pandemic in the second half of 2020. Realistically, being boiled and cooked in pots, force-fed food with poisonous snakes crawling all over you in 1,000-degree fires in 1180 would have probably been preferable to a 2020 COVID death. The fiery 1180 death would have been much quicker and less painful overall in number of maximum bearable hours of painful torture. That is, death then would have been relatively quick as opposed to the 2020 slow, lingering, suffocating, drowning like death on a ventilator where hope is offered, while death is delayed for weeks or even months. But the last days are often very painful and unpleasant, while there still is no cure for most acute patients. It's my artistic, religious, and moral view that soon Trump will be a top executive in hell punishing Republicans for, despite being excellent, finished, large-size, impressive work, hence it was relegated to that tiny cameo appearance so as not to be wasted entirely. It was based on Composito Pisa in Fiero Diablo by Buonan Amaco Buffalmacco in 1340. There are other major elements also in that work, as consolidated and presented by me, all of which remain securely and comprehensively in my hundreds of computer file folders, most chronicling and saving daily work from occasional devastating Photoshop freezes and or computer crashes. Number 17, another very short narrative, is called Feet-Front 1 by Fra Angelico again. It's a different version of Hellmouth and Satan done between 1435 and 50. This is another excellent and very natural adaptation of Trump's head and facial expressions onto the physical manifestation of the devil. His head, sweating expressions, mood. Number 18. This major work is based on the background called Cappella Bolognini by Giovanni da Modena, 1410. I added many elements to this work, including some contemporary signs to replace some in unintelligible Italian from the original 15th century work itself. Words in symbolic artwork are not encouraged, sought after, or optimal, but here the original masterpiece had some in Italian, so I updated them and added 2 or 3 more. Quite substantial work went into this vignette, like into most of them, and the work displayed here, for example, is called Final Number 8, which means it is about the 20th initially thought to be a complete final draft done over a several-day period. The signs on the work now read, "Make Russia Great Again," "No Masks," "No Fake COVID Shutdown," "Satan's Emperor for Life," "Shoot Blacks," "All Ballots are Fraudulent," and "Come and Take It," referring to my gun, as several people in this 2020 modernized version of the image are carrying assault weapons like Trump's white militant haters and fearful supporters on the 2020 TV news all September. The Proud Boys are an example of this type of group that backed Trump during the race riots and other times with weapons, but not necessarily assault rifles. There are numerous details in this substantial piece, including at least 20 easily recognizable Fox News and Trump administration sympathizers, guilty criminal accessories, and related Republican apologists and zealots, plus the present day or future demons that are brutally and painfully killing various bleeding Democrats and other good and bad political opponents all over that quite brutal large picture. That is, note the demon zealot axing Biden brutally and quite blatantly to devil Trump's right, center left. There are also many other recognizable, known from this political campaign on Earth, demons and other Trump helpers now in hell during the scene portrayed here, determinedly torturing or killing victims around that very nasty portion of hell. Obviously, and needlessly to say, we all hope that none of that violent brutality will ever actually man itself on Earth or below. In what year was this image recorded or imagined to occur? It symbolically depicts many events occurring in fall 2020, but violent retribution punishments of this type by God or the devil will likely not occur until 2021 or closely thereafter. So the date and or historical accuracy of the image is somewhat in doubt right now and depends heavily on the election in 9 days when this was written and 4 days right now. Number 19 is the last one here, and it's again by Fra Angelico, a true giant in the creation of these types of works, and his Trittico del Giudizio Universale, Last Judgment, created about 1435 to 50. Here there are numerous recognizable biased Fox News hosts and other Republicans, Trump supporters, apologists, colluders in wrongdoing, accessories, and accomplices who are receiving their just punishment and torture according to God's wisdom and mercy, or perhaps merely in accordance with their own conscience, we might hope. I don't claim to be able to read God's mind or to understand religious judgments anywhere, whether in this life or after death. Here, unlike my normal, totally original art for tens of thousands of pieces, I just do the art based on whatever famous representations seem appropriate to me in my educated, informed political frame of reference during these nasty political times, as portrayed by primarily MSNBC, Fox, and CNN, my major news sources at this time. I am actually a knowledgeable student of political philosophies and theory as practiced in the USA for the last 250 years, so this art and these views are not total, meaningless, airhead, unsubstantiated BS based on nothing but ideology, religious dogma, anger, irrationality, and or personal prejudice. As I said previously, I kind of like Trump still, and I voted for Trump once for president in 2016, which was not necessarily a mistake then, based on what was known about him and the competition at the time, but it sure would be a mistake to do it again in 2020. The last 7 of these vignettes show a malevolent, sweaty, cruel, petty, uncaring, self-centered, violent, probably narcissistic, and torturing Trump Sr. I'm now going to sign off here and to put the main image on for the final epilogue. Final conclusions on this overall too long narrative, which, as I said, you can skip completely if you want to. Anyway, my comments are Americans actually still smart enough to properly assess and then elect such a man and then self-govern through the state, local, and federal governments and national legislature and judicial bodies under a lying and immoral president like this? Arguably, the government of 1984 was like Santa Claus compared to this administration. Clearly, the answer is many Americans are not qualified to assess the validity and truth of the Trump lies and continuous false propaganda and then self-govern intelligently or properly as envisioned by the original founders. Therefore, perhaps the most important question today is whether the majority of voters in October to November 2020 that may be somewhat wiser and are at least better grounded in factual true reality than the noisy Trump minority can actually prevail in the 2020 election at all levels of government over the present actively ongoing Trump McConnell Senate tyranny of the minority warned against by the most eminent authority on the subject, de Tocqueville, back in the 1770 range. Ordinarily, the U.S. majority of voters probably could prevail here, but battling the numerous, powerful, and creative voting by mail during a pandemic, obstructions invented by Trump over the last couple of months, makes the ultimate outcome of this upcoming election still very much in doubt today, only 4 days before the election, even though the Trump coalition and its candidates are mostly grossly disfavored by about 8 to 15 percentage points nationwide as of this reading, especially in the important swing states. Nevertheless, corruption makes his election a possibility still. Trump is opposed today, according to polls, by a large majority of the 2020 USA voting population, yet his corrupt, dirty tricks have still very definitely left the final outcome hanging precariously in doubt still today. There are also uncontrolled Russian malware viruses out in the country right now as I make this video, directed at obstructing hospitals today, but perhaps the election tomorrow. Trump may be a last vestige or offshoot of the 19th century mafia for all we know. And in any case, he is attempting to establish a new form of autocratic authoritarianism government under a corrupt godfather-like dictatorship where Donald Trump talks, acts, and has the serious professional casino gambling, corruption, and crime resume of a godfather. Is a narcissistic, self-centered, economy-first policy mostly favoring all Trump family business interests only, no matter how many millions of people are killed in the economic process, the right and just policy today. It fits right into the medieval view of heresy, hell, suffering, the devil, and purgatory in my medieval-based art. In any case, did Trump personally and directly kill hundreds of thousands of Americans with his negligent actions? Or were those deaths accidental or inevitable under any president? I can't judge that objectively, but history in the future clearly will. I certainly assume and believe he negligently allowed many more deaths than he should have. That's my main quarrel with him tonight, other than his planned forecast flagrant threat and quite likely outrageous refusal to leave gracefully or to allow a fair election as to who should be president next, as he implicitly agreed and implied to do when he ran for the sacred presidency and took the oath of office. To illegally remain after he loses the election, he will need to believably tie up and contest various electoral votes in the courts, plus get hundreds of legal allies and possibly thousands of military officers that back him in various ways at now unknown and unpredictable critical locations. The military, and at some point, some of the lawyers will genuinely need to believe that Trump has somehow been legitimately, grossly wronged by our political system rather than the other way around as falsely represented now. Hopefully, Trump will not be provably or demonstrably wronged in any event, so his supporting minions will not have any justification for continuing to battle for his survival as president for months or even weeks in the courts or in city riot demonstrations, etc. Hopefully the country's and my errors on wanting a change in 2016 and therefore deciding to take a chance gamble on Trump then, joined by me and other supposedly smart, educated, and wise voters, will not be repeated in 2020. I think we learned. Also, hopefully, Trump will not be able to influence enough of his followers to corruptly prevent a fair election by mail in 9 days, but that remains to be seen. a strong economy is important, but to most of us older people, it's not worth killing millions of people aspiring to probably nonsensical herd immunity and also establishing the Trumps as the permanent ruling party of this country by divine or Trump proclaimed right. To an older person with pre-existing conditions such as I, a strong and masked-free economy is not worth becoming one of the dead in the near term, even before the next president takes office. Right now, probably 35% of the country would be willing to risk dying for the president, Trump, and sacrificing several million old liberal Democrats in the process. Possibly 45% would be willing to jeopardize their life or close to it to get rid of Trump now for good, and I'd be part of that 45%. I am not one of that minority of 35%, but part of the 45% minority. The uncertain, rather diffident 20% will be decisive in this election, and right now they are breaking against Trump. In a reasonably fair electoral process going on now unfinalized in just 4 days, which fairness is in question here, there is still approximately a 55 to 45 split in the voting population of this country in my favor tonight, and therefore Trump should be, and very hopefully will be, voted out now for good, along with the Republican majority in all federal branches of government. In the past, in a fair election, there is little doubt that Trump would be voted out, but now with the mails fouled up and all the other Supreme Court inequities and other things going on, everything's still very anxious and in doubt. Only the Supreme Court will now remain somewhat unbalanced, unrepresentative, and unfair, essentially, and that's assuming a Democratic wave happens in a few days here. So anyway, adding 1 to 3 liberal Supreme Court justices and other state and federal appellate justices also may well be the fairest solution in the next few years to balance everything out. Therefore, that important court packing is the concept that I'm talking about here. It may well happen, since the country is essentially devoid of any great wisdom and statesmanship nowadays of the type that was enjoyed prior to this century. In a democratic sweep of all branches and levels of government, realigning the courts and asserting a new tyranny by the new, somewhat larger Democratic minority will then predictably occur, keeping the country anxious and the possibility of future civil war and unrest still alive, unfortunately, until we can unite behind a younger, stronger, fair, and charismatic leader, which hopefully Biden can attempt to be for a year or two and keep the chair warm for someone else. However, although he seems like a fine man, he's rather clearly essentially too old, tired, outdated, superseded, and nearly obsoletely primarily represents older generations and policies which need drastic remodeling and renewal. So therefore we still got problems here, but the first thing would be to get rid of Trump. Anyway, signed Bruce Remington, 10/24/30